The October rain drummed against the tall windows of the Whitmore mansion like impatient fingers, each drop a reminder of time slipping away. Marcus Whitmore stood in what used to be his study, surrounded by towers of unopened mail that threatened to topple with each gust of wind rattling the old house. The mahogany desk that once commanded respect in boardrooms across Boston now served as a graveyard for overdue notices, legal documents, and the remnants of a life he no longer recognized as his own. 3 years had passed since everything fell apart, yet the wound felt as fresh as yesterday. The day Elizabeth died, the day Richard revealed his true nature, the day Marcus discovered that trust was nothing more than a luxury he could no longer afford. He picked up another envelope marked "Final Notice" in aggressive red letters, his hands trembling not from fear but from the rage that had become his most faithful companion. The doorbell's ancient chime echoed through the empty halls, a sound so foreign that Marcus initially mistook it for another trick of the wind. No one came to the Whitmore mansion anymore. The staff had been dismissed long ago. Friends had grown tired of his silence, and even the most persistent reporters had given up trying to extract a story from the man who had once been Boston's golden boy of technology. He ignored the bell, returning his attention to the financial chaos spread before him. Numbers that used to make sense now swam before his eyes like hieroglyphs from a dead civilization. His company's assets, his personal investments, his wife's inheritance, all tangled in a web of legal maneuvers orchestrated by the man he had once called his best friend. The bell rang again, more insistent this time, followed by a firm knock that seemed to penetrate the very walls of his isolation. Marcus closed his eyes, wondering if he could simply wait for whoever it was to leave. But something in the rhythm of the knocking, professional, patient yet determined, told him this visitor wasn't going away. He descended the grand staircase, each step echoing in the vast foyer, like a countdown to an execution. Through the ornate glass panels beside the door, he could make out the silhouette of a woman, her dark hair pulled back in a neat bun, a leather briefcase clutched in her hand. She stood perfectly still despite the rain, as if she had all the time in the world. Marcus hesitated with his hand on the brass doorknob, the cold metal a stark reminder of how long it had been since he'd willingly invited anyone into his sanctuary. The woman knocked again, and this time he heard her voice, clear and unwavering through the heavy oak door. "Mr. Whitmore, my name is Sarah Chen. I'm here about your financial consultation. I know you're in there, and I know you need help." The words hit him like a physical blow. Help. Such a simple word, yet it carried the weight of admission, of vulnerability, of the very thing he had sworn never to need again. But as he looked back at the chaos waiting for him in the study, at the towers of bills and the legal documents that might as well have been written in a foreign language, Marcus realized that pride was a luxury he could no longer afford either. With a deep breath that tasted of defeat and possibility in equal measure, he turned the lock and opened the door to let Sarah Chen into his life. Sarah Chen had seen many broken men in her 15 years as a financial consultant, but Marcus Whitmore was something else entirely. He stood before her in the doorway like a ghost haunting his own life, his once pristine appearance now a testament to neglect. The expensive suit hung loose on his frame, wrinkled and stained with what looked like coffee from days past. His dark hair, which she remembered from magazine covers as perfectly styled, now fell in unkempt waves across his forehead, partially obscuring eyes that held depths of pain she recognized all too well. "You're persistent," he said, his voice hoarse from disuse. He stepped aside reluctantly, allowing her to enter the foyer that must have once welcomed Boston's elite. Now it felt like a mausoleum, filled with dust motes dancing in the gray afternoon light, filtering through grimy windows. Sarah had done her homework before coming here. She knew about Elizabeth Whitmore's tragic accident, about the business partnership that had turned toxic, about the lawsuits that had been piling up like storm clouds. But knowing the facts and witnessing their human cost were two entirely different things. The man before her wasn't just financially ruined, he was emotionally bankrupt, and that was a currency she understood better than most. "Your attorney, Mr. Harrison, was quite insistent that you needed my services," she replied, setting her briefcase down carefully on the marble floor. "He mentioned that time was running out." Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Time ran out 3 years ago, Miss Chen. What we're dealing with now is just the cleanup." He gestured vaguely toward the interior of the house. "Welcome to the aftermath." As they walked through the mansion, Sarah tried to mask her shock at the deterioration. Priceless artwork hung askew on walls that hadn't seen a cleaning in months. Oriental rugs worth more than most people's annual salaries were stained and frayed. The smell of neglect hung in the air like a funeral shroud, competing with the lingering aroma of takeout containers and untouched meals. They entered what had once been an impressive study, and Sarah immediately understood why Harrison had called her with such urgency. The room looked like a tornado had swept through a bank, leaving behind a debris field of financial documents, legal papers, and unopened mail. Bills cascaded from the desk like a paper waterfall, and she could see at least 3 different eviction notices prominently displayed among the chaos. "How long has it been like this?" she asked, setting her briefcase on the only clear spot she could find on a leather chair that had seen better decades. "Since the day I realized that everything I thought I knew about my life was a lie," Marcus replied, slumping into the chair behind his desk. "Richard, my former business partner, he was very thorough in his betrayal. Not only did he steal from the company, but he made sure to leave me with just enough legal responsibility to drown in." Sarah opened her briefcase and pulled out a yellow legal pad, her movements deliberate and professional. She had learned long ago that organization was not just about numbers, it was about hope. Every sorted document, every balanced ledger, every resolved discrepancy was a small victory against chaos. "Mr. Whitmore, I need you to understand something," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "I've seen worse than this. I've helped people climb out of financial holes so deep they couldn't see daylight. But I can't do this alone. You're going to have to trust me." The word trust hung in the air between them like a challenge. Marcus stared at her for a long moment, and Sarah saw something flicker in his eyes. Not hope, not yet, but perhaps the memory of what hope used to feel like. "I don't trust anyone anymore, Miss Chen," he said finally. "But I suppose that's a luxury I can't afford, isn't it?" Sarah smiled for the first time since entering the house. "Trust isn't a luxury, Mr. Whitmore. It's a necessity. And sometimes it's the only currency that can buy you a second chance." Outside, the rain continued its relentless assault on the windows, but inside the study, something had shifted. The chaos remained, but now it had a witness, someone who looked at the mess and saw possibility instead of impossibility. Sarah rolled up her sleeves and reached for the first stack of papers, ready to begin the long journey of putting Marcus Whitmore's life back together, one document at a time. The first week of Sarah's presence in the Whitmore mansion felt like watching a careful dance between 2 wounded animals, each circling the other with cautious respect and barely concealed fear. Marcus had established his rules with military precision. Sarah could work in the study from 9 to 5. She was not to enter the East Wing where Elizabeth's belongings remained untouched, and under no circumstances was she to ask about anything that didn't directly relate to numbers on paper. Sarah accepted these boundaries without question, understanding that some walls were built not to keep others out, but to keep the builder from falling apart entirely. She had her own rules too, though she kept them to herself. She would not pity him, she would not try to fix his broken heart, and she would absolutely not let herself care about Marcus Whitmore beyond the professional obligation she had undertaken. But rules, she was learning, were fragile things when faced with the reality of human connection. On Tuesday morning, she arrived to find Marcus sitting at his desk, staring at a photograph she hadn't noticed before. It was a wedding picture, him and Elizabeth on what must have been the happiest day of their lives, both radiant with the kind of joy that seemed to illuminate the very air around them. His finger traced the edge of the frame with devastating gentleness. She wanted to renovate this study, he said without looking up, his voice barely above a whisper. Said it was too dark, too masculine. She had plans for bay windows, built-in bookshelves, maybe a reading nook where she could curl up with her romance novels. He laughed softly, but the sound was hollow. I told her we'd do it next year. There was always going to be a next year. Sarah felt something crack inside her chest, a hairline fracture in the professional wall she had built around her heart. She had lost her own parents in a car accident when she was 22, and she recognized the particular agony of unfinished conversations, of plans that would never come to fruition. What would she think of all this? Sarah asked gently, gesturing to the organized stacks of documents they had been working through. Marcus looked up at her then, really looked at her, and Sarah saw something she hadn't expected: curiosity. She'd probably be furious that I let it get this bad. Elizabeth was. She was a force of nature when it came to organization. She could look at any mess and see exactly how to fix it. He paused, studying Sarah's face. She would have liked you, I think. The compliment hit Sarah harder than she expected, and she found herself blinking back tears that had no business being in a professional consultation. We should probably get back to work, she said, her voice not quite steady. But Marcus wasn't finished. Why do you do this? He asked suddenly. Financial consulting for people who've lost everything? It can't be the most lucrative specialty. Sarah considered lying, giving him the safe answer about finding fulfillment in helping others. Instead, she found herself telling the truth. Because I know what it's like to have your world collapse overnight. I know what it feels like to be surrounded by paperwork and legal documents that might as well be written in hieroglyphics. I know what it's like to be so lost in your own life that you can't find your way back to who you used to be. The silence that followed was heavy with understanding. Marcus set down the photograph and reached for one of the files they had been working on, but Sarah noticed his hands were steadier now, his movements more purposeful. Richard wasn't always a monster, he said suddenly, apropos of nothing. We were college roommates, best friends, best man at each other's weddings. When we started the company, it felt like we were building something that would outlast us both. His jaw tightened. I keep wondering if there were signs I missed, red flags I ignored because I wanted to believe in the friendship we had. Sarah nodded, understanding the self-torture of hindsight. Sometimes the people closest to us are the ones who can hurt us the most, precisely because we trust them with our blind spots. Is that what happened to you? Marcus asked, and Sarah realized she had revealed more than she intended. My parents died in a car accident, she said carefully, but before that, I was engaged to someone who, let's just say he saw their death as an opportunity rather than a tragedy. He tried to manipulate me into signing over their life insurance money to him, claiming it was what they would have wanted. She laughed bitterly. I was so grief-stricken I almost did it. If it hadn't been for a lawyer who took pity on me, I would have lost everything. Marcus reached across the desk and, for just a moment, his fingers brushed against hers. The contact was brief, barely there, but it sent an electric shock through Sarah's entire system. I'm sorry, he said simply, and something in his voice told her he understood the weight of betrayal by someone you loved. We're quite a pair, aren't we? Sarah said, managing a small smile. Two people who learned the hard way that trust is a luxury we can't afford. Maybe, Marcus replied, his eyes never leaving hers. Or maybe we're two people who are learning that trust isn't about avoiding the possibility of being hurt again. Maybe it's about deciding that some things are worth the risk. The afternoon light filtering through the tall windows seemed brighter suddenly, casting everything in a golden glow that made the chaos around them look less like destruction and more like the raw materials of something new. Sarah felt her carefully constructed walls beginning to shift, and for the first time in years, she wasn't sure she wanted to rebuild them. The breakthrough came on a Thursday morning when Sarah discovered what she could only describe as a financial smoking gun, buried in a file that had been mislabeled as miscellaneous tax documents. Her hands trembled as she read through the series of transfers, each one more damning than the last. Richard Blackwood hadn't just stolen from the company. He had orchestrated a systematic embezzlement scheme that went back nearly 5 years, long before Elizabeth's death. "Marcus!" she called out, her voice cutting through the morning quiet. He looked up from his coffee, the first real meal she had seen him consume since her arrival. "You need to see this." As he read over her shoulder, Sarah felt the tension radiating from his body like heat from a furnace. His breathing became shallow, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the desk. "That bastard," he whispered, and Sarah heard something new in his voice. Not just anger, but a terrible, dawning realization. "There's more," she said gently, pulling out another document. "This shows Richard had access to your personal accounts too. Look at this transfer. It's dated 3 days before Elizabeth's accident." Marcus went completely still, and Sarah watched as the color drained from his face. 3 days before, he repeated mechanically. He knew the company was about to collapse, and he was already positioning himself to take everything. But Sarah's trained eye had caught something else, something that made her stomach clench with dread. "Marcus, this maintenance record for Elizabeth's car. When was her last service appointment?" He looked at the paper she handed him, and Sarah watched understanding hit him like a physical blow. 2 weeks before the accident, Richard recommended the mechanic, said he was the best in Boston. His voice cracked. He told Elizabeth to go there himself. The silence in the room was deafening. Sarah felt like she was watching a man die and be reborn simultaneously. The weight of revelation reshaping everything he thought he knew about his wife's death. The accident that had destroyed his world hadn't been an accident at all. It had been a calculated move by someone he had trusted with his life. "We need to call the police," Sarah said, but Marcus was already shaking his head. "With what proof? A suspicious transfer and a maintenance record. Richard's too smart for that. He's had 3 years to cover his tracks." Marcus stood abruptly, pacing to the window like a caged animal. "He killed her, Sarah. He killed my wife for money, and then he let me believe it was just a tragic accident, while he systematically destroyed everything else I cared about." Sarah had seen people break before, but watching Marcus confront the magnitude of Richard's betrayal was like witnessing someone's soul being torn apart in real time. She wanted to comfort him, to offer some words of hope or reassurance, but what comfort could there be for a revelation like this? "There might be a way," she said carefully. "These financial records show a pattern of behavior. If we can trace all the transfers, document every fraudulent transaction, we might be able to build a case that's strong enough to warrant a criminal investigation." Marcus turned from the window, and Sarah saw something in his eyes she hadn't seen before. A spark of the man he used to be, the brilliant businessman who had built an empire from nothing. How long would that take? Weeks? Maybe months? And it would mean going through everything, every account, every transfer, every financial decision Richard was involved in for the past 5 years. She paused, knowing she was about to cross a line she had sworn she wouldn't cross. "I would have to stay here, work around the clock. This can't be done remotely." The implication hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they should cross. Sarah staying in the mansion would mean abandoning all pretense of professional distance. It would mean eating meals together, sharing the quiet moments of morning coffee and late-night determination. It would mean allowing the connection that had been building between them to grow into something that could either save them both or destroy what little stability they had managed to build. "You would do that?" Marcus asked, and Sarah heard the vulnerability in his question, the man behind the grief asking if someone would choose to stay in his broken world. "For justice? For Elizabeth? For you?" Sarah felt her professional walls crumbling completely. "Yes, I would do that." Marcus crossed the room in 3 quick strides, and, for a moment, Sarah thought he might embrace her. Instead, he stopped just close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his dark eyes, close enough to feel the warmth of his breath against her cheek. "Thank you," he said simply, but the words carried the weight of everything he couldn't say. Gratitude for her competence, for her compassion, for her willingness to fight a battle that wasn't technically hers. "Don't thank me yet," Sarah replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "We're about to go to war with a man who's already killed once. This could get very dangerous, very quickly." Marcus smiled then, the first genuine smile she had seen from him, and it transformed his entire face. "Then it's a good thing I have the best financial warrior in Boston on my side." Outside, storm clouds were gathering on the horizon, but inside the study, two people who had forgotten how to hope were beginning to remember that sometimes the only way out of hell is to fight your way through it. And sometimes the best weapon you can have is someone willing to stand beside you in the darkness. The war began 3 weeks later, when Richard Blackwood received the subpoena. Sarah had moved into the mansion's guest wing, transforming what had once been Elizabeth's morning room into a command center filled with financial records, legal documents, and evidence boards that looked like something from a crime drama. The irony wasn't lost on either of them that they were using Elizabeth's favorite room to seek justice for her death. Marcus had changed during those weeks. The broken man who had opened the door to Sarah was gradually being replaced by someone harder, more focused, driven by a purpose that burned brighter than his grief. He ate regular meals now, showered daily, and wore suits that actually fit. But Sarah could see the cost of this transformation in the tension that never left his shoulders, in the way he sometimes stared at Elizabeth's photograph with an intensity that bordered on obsession. The phone call came on a Tuesday evening while they were working late, surrounded by takeout containers and the soft glow of desk lamps. Marcus answered with his usual wariness, but Sarah watched his expression shift from caution to shock to something that looked like fear. "What do you mean, dismissed?" Marcus said into the phone. "Harrison, you said the evidence was solid." There was a long pause. "What do you mean he has counter-evidence?" Sarah felt ice form in her stomach as she watched Marcus's face crumble. When he finally hung up, his hands were shaking. "Richard filed a motion to have the case dismissed," Marcus said, his voice hollow. "He claims we fabricated the evidence. Worse than that, he's filed a countersuit claiming that I'm the one who embezzled money from the company and that Elizabeth discovered it before her death." The room seemed to spin around Sarah. "That's impossible. We have the bank records, the transfer authorizations." "He has bank records too," Marcus interrupted, "ones that show transfers going the other way. He's claiming I've been mentally unstable since Elizabeth's death, that I've constructed an elaborate delusion to avoid facing my own guilt." Sarah stared at him, seeing the terrible doubt creeping into his eyes. "You don't believe him, do you?" "I don't know what I believe anymore," Marcus whispered. "What if I'm wrong? What if grief has made me see things that aren't there? What if I really am just a broken man looking for someone to blame?" The defeat in his voice broke something inside Sarah. She had watched this man slowly rebuild himself over the past month, had seen him fight his way back from the edge of despair, and now Richard was trying to push him back into the abyss with the cruelest weapon of all, self-doubt. "Look at me," she said firmly, moving to stand directly in front of him. "Marcus, look at me." When his eyes met hers, she saw the scared, lost man he had been 3 years ago, the one who had been so thoroughly betrayed that he had forgotten how to trust his own judgment. "I have spent the last month examining every financial record you possess," she said, her voice steady and sure. "I know the difference between genuine transactions and manufactured ones. I know what embezzlement looks like, and I know what a cover-up looks like. Richard Blackwood is guilty, and deep down you know it too. But what if—" "No." Sarah reached out and took his hands in hers, feeling the tremor that ran through his fingers. "Richard is playing the same game he's always played, making you doubt yourself so thoroughly that you'll give up fighting. Don't let him win." Marcus looked down at their joined hands, and Sarah saw something shift in his expression. "Elizabeth used to do that," he said quietly. "When I was having doubts about a business decision, or worried that I was making the wrong choice, she would hold my hands and tell me to trust myself. She was a smart woman," Sarah replied, not letting go, "and she would want you to fight for the truth." Slowly, Marcus lifted his eyes to meet hers again, And this time Sarah saw not doubt, but determination. "Then that's what we'll do. We'll fight. Together," Sarah said, and the word carried more weight than either of them was ready to acknowledge. "Together," Marcus agreed, and when he squeezed her hands, Sarah felt something pass between them that went far beyond professional partnership or even friendship. It was a recognition, a promise, a step across a line that neither of them could uncross. Outside, the wind howled through the trees surrounding the mansion, but inside Elizabeth's morning room, two people who had both been betrayed by love were learning that sometimes the only way to heal from betrayal is to risk trusting again. And sometimes the person worthy of that trust has been standing right beside you all along, holding your hands steady while you remember how to believe in yourself. The final confrontation came 6 months later in a Boston courtroom that felt more like a gladiatorial arena than a place of justice. Sarah sat in the front row behind the prosecutor's table, her heart hammering as she watched Marcus take the witness stand. He looked nothing like the broken man she had first encountered. His suit was impeccable, his posture confident, his eyes clear and focused, but she could see the fine tremor in his hands as he was sworn in, the only sign of the battle raging inside him. Richard Blackwood sat at the defendant's table with his expensive legal team, looking every inch the successful businessman he pretended to be. When his eyes met Sarah's across the courtroom, she saw something that chilled her, not guilt or fear, but amusement, as if this entire proceeding was nothing more than an elaborate game he was confident of winning. The prosecutor began with the financial evidence that Sarah had painstakingly assembled, walking the jury through 5 years of systematic embezzlement with the precision of a surgeon. Bank records, transfer authorizations, forged signatures, each piece of evidence built upon the last, creating an undeniable pattern of fraud and betrayal. But Richard's defense attorney was skilled, casting doubt on every document, suggesting that grief had driven Marcus to construct an elaborate conspiracy theory to avoid facing his own financial mismanagement. The attorney painted a picture of a man so consumed by loss that he would sacrifice his oldest friend to avoid admitting his own failures. Then came the moment Sarah had been dreading, Marcus's testimony about Elizabeth's death. His voice remained steady as he described the morning of the accident, the phone call from the hospital, the devastating discovery that the woman he loved was gone. But when the defense attorney began his cross-examination, Sarah felt her world tilt. "Mr. Whitmore," the attorney said with practiced sympathy, "isn't it true that you and your wife had been arguing about money in the weeks before her death?" Marcus's jaw tightened. "We had discussed some financial concerns." "Yes. And isn't it true that Elizabeth had discovered irregularities in your company's accounts?" "She had questions about some transactions," Marcus admitted, and Sarah saw several jurors lean forward with interest. "Questions that led her to threaten to expose your embezzlement unless you came clean," the prosecutor objected, but the damage was done. Sarah watched the doubt creep into the jurors' faces, saw them beginning to wonder if they had been looking at the wrong man all along. But then Marcus did something unexpected. He looked directly at Richard, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight that seemed to fill the entire courtroom. "Elizabeth would never have threatened me with exposure," he said quietly. "If she had discovered I was stealing, she would have helped me fix it. If she had found evidence of fraud, she would have stood beside me to fight it. That's who she was. Not my accuser, but my partner. And the man sitting over there knows that because he knew her too. He knew that the only way to stop Elizabeth from exposing his crimes was to make sure she never got the chance." The courtroom was dead silent. Even Richard's attorney seemed momentarily stunned by the raw honesty in Marcus's voice. "Richard Blackwood didn't just steal my money," Marcus continued, his eyes never leaving his former friend's face. "He stole my wife. He stole my future. He stole 3 years of my life that I spent believing I had somehow failed the woman I loved. But he didn't steal my truth, and he didn't steal my ability to fight for justice. When the jury returned with their verdict 2 hours later, Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as she heard the words, "Guilty on all counts." Richard Blackwood was led away in handcuffs, his facade finally crumbling as he faced the consequences of his betrayal. But the real victory came later outside the courthouse, when Marcus turned to Sarah with tears in his eyes and said, "I couldn't have done this without you. You didn't just help me find justice, you helped me find myself again." Sarah looked at this man who had become so much more than a client, so much more than a friend, and realized that somewhere in the process of rebuilding his life, he had helped her rebuild hers too. "So what happens now?" she asked, suddenly uncertain about a future that no longer included financial chaos and legal battles. Marcus smiled, the same genuine smile that had transformed his face months ago, but brighter now, unencumbered by grief and doubt. "Now we find out what comes after the ending," he said, taking her hand. "Together." As they walked away from the courthouse and toward whatever came next, Sarah realized that sometimes the most important accounting couldn't be measured in dollars and cents, but in the courage to trust again, to love again, and to believe that some stories have the power to rewrite themselves with better endings.